All right, at this time, I believe as Mr. Eller's being proposed as an expert, I don't think the exclusionary order would apply here in this matter, so I won't do that line of questioning. If you'd like to inquire on direct, you may. Mr. Pryor, I know you've potentially offered some exhibits here. If you'd like to start with those to get them admitted, if they are going to be admitted, we could begin there, or you can begin with direct.
Okay, and Judge 137 would be Mr. Eller's report. 138 was only for demonstrative purposes as part of the cast evidence. That was what Officer Stubbs and Officer Balance had testified to. And then 139, Judge, would be Mr. Eller's video presentation, which I understand the state is. I'll let them speak for themselves, I guess.
All right, let's take those in turn. On the offered first exhibit, 137, it's been offered. And who's going to be conducting cross on this witness?
I will, Your Honor. And I would just inquire of Mr. Pryor if the issue we discussed previously was taken care of in that exhibit, and if it is,
Yes, Judge.
then the state does not have any objection to any of those exhibits.
Okay, exhibit 137, exhibit 138, and exhibit 139 are each admitted. You can begin with your direct then, Mr. Pryor.
And Judge, I believe the clerk may have put the wrong tag. Demonstrative 1 and 139. My 139 would be the audio presentation, so those tags would need to be switched.
All right, we'll straighten those out. And Mr. Pryor, if you could pre-mark exhibits, that would be helpful, so the clerks aren't required to do that while they've got their hands full doing other things here during trial, please.
And Judge, I'm going to ask at some point to be using the Elmo device as far as Mr. Eller's report, but with the court's permission, I'd like to proceed with my direct examination.
All right, you can go ahead and get started with direct.
Thank you. Would you state your name, spell your last name for the record for me, please?
Yes, sir. My name is Patrick Eller, E-L-L-E-R.
And may I call you Patrick?
Yes,
We know each other, so you've been retained as an expert in this case, is that correct?
yes, I have.
Okay, and Patrick, can you tell me a little bit about what you do for an occupation?
Yes, I am the CEO and principal digital forensic examiner for a company called Metadata Forensics, LLC, which is based out of Richmond, Virginia.
And what type of business is Metadata Forensics engaged in?
So Metadata Forensics is a full service consulting and training firm that does digital forensics on devices. We do expert testimony. We do training for law enforcement, attorneys, victim advocates. We examine any device that contains data or any data that's turned over to us.
Okay, so it's a broad range of anything that's an electronic or digital of any kind. Your firm engages in the investigation, discovery, and reporting of what findings you find as a result of being provided that data. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about your education?
Yes. So I have a undergraduate degree in criminal justice from Troy, and then I have a master's in science and digital forensics from the University of Maryland, Global Campus. Outside of that, I have numerous digital forensics training courses and certifications over a 15-year period.
Okay. Can you tell me, and you talked a little bit about the training, can you talk to me about a little bit about your previous experience in terms of government affiliations?
Yes. So I spent 20 years in military law enforcement for the Army. Throughout that time, I served in positions of just a regular police officer, through criminal investigator, through supervisor, supervising general crimes, drug crimes, and then finally computer crimes. When I finished my career with the Army in 2019, I was the command digital forensic examiner over the digital forensics program for the entire U.S. Army criminal investigation program.
Okay. And in terms of education, training of other entities. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yes. So throughout my career and even currently under my current company, we continue to train attorneys, both civilian and military, and we also still train law enforcement, both military and civilian law enforcement through the National Forensics Academy, through the United States Army Military Police School, in digital evidence and all types of crimes.
Are there any certifications that you have that you can discuss today?
Yes, so I've been previously certified as a digital forensic examiner and computer crimes investigator through the Defense Cyber Training Academy in Linthicum, Maryland. And then I also have multiple vendor certifications as well.
And if I understand correctly, I can't recall if you previously talked about you running the General Army's entire forensics examination department. Was that discussed?
Yes, that was my final position in the Army. So from the last 7 years that I was in the Army, I helped build out the digital forensics program for the Army Criminal Investigation Division at Quantico. And then we spread it across the globe, building multiple locations out with digital forensic support across the Army.
And then you mentioned the fact that you have educated lawyers, law enforcement, other entities. Are you currently in the business of teaching and educating at this point?
Yes, we do about 25 to 30 classes per year for legal entities and law enforcement entities in the field of digital forensics investigations.
And what about any professional associations?
Yes, so I'm a fellow with the American Academy for Forensic Science in the digital and multimedia section. And the affiliation there is, that's a decade worth of work to get to the status of fellow. I've spent time as the chair of that section. And then I've also was affiliated and have been a previous commissioner for the Forensic Science Education Accreditation. That is the program that accredits the forensic science programs at universities across the country.
And engaging in your profession, does that require any specialized knowledge or understanding?
Yes, it does.
Can you discuss that with me briefly?
So with digital forensics, the use of digital data that the average person uses on a daily basis, I equate it to the best scenario is the iceberg effect. So the part of an iceberg that you would see above the water, the 10% of it, is the amount of data that individuals would typically deal with on a device any given day. The 90% of it below the water that you don't see is the data that we specialize in looking at and getting to the metadata in order to do what's called attribution. And attribution is just the ability to say what the data actually means or what it doesn't mean, or what it shows or what it doesn't show.
So when you use the term metadata, for someone like me, or maybe not even someone like me, someone who's at least somewhat educated in phones and electronics, what does metadata mean?
Metadata is simply data about data. And so, as an example, if you have a picture, you see the picture, but the metadata is all the information that made that picture become a picture. Dates, like date and timestamps, location data, information about the device that would have created that image, information about if the image has been manipulated, if it's been changed, if it's been filtered, if it's been cropped, has the date been changed, all the information that gets tracked by the operating system when using data is what metadata is.
Now I'm going to get off the subject a little bit and move towards this concept of the manner in which you can identify certain phones through metadata. And what are the different ways that you can identify either a location or find that a phone is in a particular area, and what sources of information do you use?
So when you talk about locating phones, there are multiple sources. One being the device itself contains location data. The other are cellular providers who maintain certain amounts of data about the transmission of information between the device and the carrier that travels through towers and switches that they maintain. And then there's also metadata that's maintained by all of the applications on the phone, depending on what you choose to share as the settings with that application. There is data that you can request from Google, from Apple, from Meta, from Twitter. All of the individual applications also store data.
And if you were to identify the best source of information to identify the location of a phone, what source would that be?
In my opinion, the best source would be the phone itself. And I understand that there are settings that you can turn on and off about location data. However, there's data that is still being tracked within the device itself by the operating system in the phone that can be retrieved as well. That comes down to what they call native location data. Native location data is data that's populated on the device that is actually showing where a device would be.
Okay. And then what other sources can you use to identify the location, or at least a close proximity of what the location of a phone is?
So you can use information that is captured by the phone manufacturer or the operating system on the phone, be it iOS for Apple or Google for most of the other devices that are used across.
Okay. Now, an interesting question I have is, what if I have Verizon and another phone has Apple or T-Mobile? Does that change whether you can access it through Google?
It does not change. It just changed what they would store because it depends on what you're using on the device itself.
Okay.
So AT&T can have Android phones and Apple phones. Verizon can have Android phones and Apple phones. And so if you have an Android device, you would have some Google information because you're required to have that Gmail address in order to register the device.
So in other words, regardless of whether you, well, I guess I'll rephrase this. So in other words, by just having an Android device, you're required to have a Gmail account. In that sense, Google can track you regardless of through your Gmail account, correct?
Yes, they would have information about you registering the device. They would have information about what services you've enabled, what services you haven't, and then they would have what you're allowing to be stored.
Okay. Now, in terms of disabling a device,
Yes.
is it as simple as on my phone as just pulling my phone out and saying settings and turning off location?
So that is one way to turn off information. But the thing with Google is, as far as Google goes, is there's also web and activity information. There are settings within your Google account that you have to change, not just turning off location services on the device itself.
So if someone were even trying to disable their phone, it's more than just flipping to a page and saying disable.
Well, you could just turn the device off.
Okay. Or you do the turn off the location.
Correct.
Okay. Okay. Now, I want to discuss with you, as part of your review, do you recall what documents and pieces of evidence you observed and examined as part of this case?
Yes, there are a lot. I mean, if you're talking about a specific item, because there were a lot of devices, a lot of data that was turned over to be reviewed, that was gathered through Google, through Apple, through devices, through other sources.
Okay. Now you, as part of this examination and as part of my office asking you to review this information, did you have an occasion to review some what is called geofence evidence?
Yes, I did.
Talk to me a little bit about in what would be my term, simpler terms, about what is geofence evidence.
So geofence evidence is, it's not something that Google intended to even be used in this manner. But the point behind that is geofence allows you to take a location, put a radius around it, and submit a search warrant in order to gain information about devices that would have passed through that geofence or within a certain proximity of that geofence.
Okay. And Judge, before I go any further, I don't have a direct recollection. Did we admit 137, 138, and 139?
We did.
Okay, thank you, Judge, Your Honor. Now, you had an opportunity to also listen to the testimony of Officer Stubbs, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And then Officer Balance, is that correct?
Yeah, agent balance, yes.
Agent Balance?
Yes, that's correct.
And you had an opportunity to, examine what their testimony was in terms of what they presented to this jury. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Can you testify about some of the conclusions you drew from listening to their testimony?
So, well,
Let's
Objection, that's overly broad.
talk about their location data in terms of their geofence testimony about Alex Cox's phone on, let's say, September 9th.
okay.
Go ahead.
What would you like to know about it?
Well, I'd like to know what you took an opportunity to examine the geofence evidence from September 9th and listen to the testimony of Officer Stubbs. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Did you find anything of interest in terms of his testimony that caused you to conduct further review?
Yes. So in listening to the testimony about how the geofence was done and what was returned as part of the search warrant from Google and the geofence, I went back and looked at the return data that was given back by Google for the geofence, and I found that there were more devices than what were actually requested to be identified.
And we've previously marked Exhibit 138, and I can put up on the screen and tell me which of these screens we want you to examine. Judge, if I could use the HDMI,
Yes, if you're going to
I'll let
publish.
you know when I'm ready, Judge.
Which exhibit are you publishing?
138. And not yet, Judge. It's and Judge, if we could at this point. Now you recognize this document, is that correct?
Yes.
And that was the document from Sergeant Stubbs, is that correct?
Yes, this was a search and a season search warrant that was submitted to Google to get the device IDs, or excuse me, to provide information about these individual device IDs that were returned from the first part of the Google geofence search warrant that produces anonymous device IDs that are assigned by Google.
Okay, and then if we look under the words, which are right in the middle of the screen, premises, that's addressed to the Google.
Yes, it is.
And then just below that, there's a line that starts with the word 11.
Yes.
And what does that involve?
So there, what's being requested are information about who those device IDs belong to.
Now, I need you to talk a little bit about that, okay? About the concept of device IDs. That ID doesn't necessarily mean it's a phone number, does it?
No, that ID is Google assigned anonymous numbers that only Google can trace that number back to an individual user.
Would this be properly characterized as a security issue with Google?
I can't say why they do that, but this is why they provide when you submit the geofence, they provide you a list of these numbers. And then you have to submit a second search warrant like this one in order to get information about who the subscribers were that are linked to those numbers.
So if I understand correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong. At this point, there was a search warrant issued by Detective Stubbs, is that correct?
Yes,
And it was sent to Google. And he identified 11 IDs that he'd like some information on.
yes, that's correct.
Okay. And then, and the manner in which he would choose these 11 IDs would be what?
So I can't speak to his exact manner. Based on the testimony that I reviewed, it said that they took all the data and put it in a system and attempted to identify the ones that had commonality.
Okay. And when we talk about commonality, what does that mean?
So commonality would mean that based on the review of my understanding of what they did was they were trying to show devices that would have been in multiple places.
Okay. Okay. And the information that they're including is described in A, B, C, and D. Is that right?
That is the information they're requesting.
The information, the name, the address, contact, that sort of stuff.
That's correct.
Okay. And then at some point, as we scroll down, there is information provided. And can you talk a little bit about this information?
Yes. So in the far left column where it says device ID, that is the device IDs that we were talking about just a few seconds ago, further up. And then from there, the time and date is the date and time of when that device ID would have been seen inside of the radius that they provided for their initial search warrant for the geofence. And then you'd have the latitude and longitude, which would be the location data. The source of that action or the source of why this was recorded or where it was from would be Wi-Fi, GPS, and then that map display radius is their margin of error.
Okay. And Judge, does he have a red? You do?
Laser pointer?
Yes.
I think there is one there.
Okay. And if you really slowly again, because just so making sure that we track us, could I have you go over that again and starting with the device ID with the laser pointer?
Yes. So the device ID right there explains that anonymous number that is assigned by Google that only within their records where they store this information are they able to link this back to an individual device.
Okay.
The next column over with the time and date, that is the time and date of this information here, which is the location and the source of that information, and then the margin of error that was recorded for the information here by those devices to be associated with that initial geofence warrant that was submitted for the radius of what they were searching for on that particular day.
So if I understand, we have the device ID on the left, which is under the word location 1. The next would be the date. And in this particular screen that Officer Stubbs requested, looks like September 9th of 2019 and at 9:18. Is that correct?
I see 919 as the first entry.
9:19. Oh my goodness, I need my glasses. 9:19:38, it looks like. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And then when we're talking about the longitude and latitude, do you recall what location Officer Stubbs was interested in?
That would be the Chad Daybell residence.
Okay, and you reviewed this data as part of your review of this case. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
And you reviewed this information that Officer Stubbs and one of the other officers, Balance, testified to regarding this information as well. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay, what did you find in terms of your investigation of note in your review?
So In my investigation of looking at this information and going to not just this paper copy of this record, but looking at the actual return that came back from Google that these records were contained in, there was a lot of other devices. And there was devices prior to 9/19 on September 9th, as well as devices within there's more. There's more records that were actually provided than what you would see here.
Okay, so to put this in plain English, for me to understand and for everyone else to understand, what this data shows is that these are IDs of phones that are in the proximity of the Chad Daybell property or on the Chad Daybell property on 9/9 of 2019, correct?
Their devices, yes.
For devices. So this list of things that you have in front of you include all of the device IDs that somehow registered at or near the Chad Daybell property on September 9th.
This does not include all of them. This includes only the ones that they were asking to be identified.
Okay, and we're going to get to that in a minute, but I want to put this in context a little bit. So if depending on the radius, if a phone was either on the Chad Daybell property at any time or was near the Chad Daybell property, depending on the radius, you would get an ID of some sort. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what is the source of that ID? Where is that ID coming from? What is how is that ID arriving? Is that through the Google app?
It is through all of the information that Google tracks from a device.
And when they're saying the ID, that could include someone who doesn't turn off their Facebook location. Is that fair?
It could be, yes.
That's someone who doesn't turn off their location on their Gmail. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's someone who could do something with their Twitter or any other app that they have on their phone and they just fail to disengage.
Objection leading.
Sustained.
Would it be that if there's a failure to disengage any location data on any of the apps, that you would get an ID number?
Objection leading.
Sustained.
What would be the process of obtaining IDs other than turning off the location device on a phone?
So this information that's being tracked across this, for instance, if you were to connect to a Wi-Fi signal from a device, you would also generate a field within this. And so it's not just the device itself, but what the device is doing and what information Google is populating within their records about what's going on that device.
Okay, so when we look at the numbers that are provided here, these are all a series of numbers.
Yes.
You testified that this wasn't an exhaustive list. What do you mean by that?
So the full list of devices, actually, it was returned in spreadsheet format. And when sorted, you would see one by the order of time and date, because you can see here a lot of these are out of time and date. Like, it's not in time date sequence, it's in device ID sequence.
Okay. Did you engage in any attempt to format them in a certain way?
Yes, I did.
And what did that involve?
So I took the spreadsheet that was returned by Google and I filtered the information based on the time and date so that it went in chronological order. And I was able to then identify the device of Alex Cox based on the information that was provided within their reports. And then I was able to take the device IDs that are further up in the pages of this search warrant and identify those in those records as well, commingled with all of the other records that were provided by Google.
So you recall the testimony of Officer Stubbs, is that correct?
Yes, I do.
And there was a representation regarding finding Alex Cox's ID among these searches as one of the pertinent phones located as part of this search warrant. Is that correct?
That's correct.
As part of this search warrant, did you recall any comments or do you recall any testimony as to whether or not there was any ID or information to suggest on 9/9 Chad Daybell's phone was also part of the location data?
I do not recall hearing that it was. What I recall from the testimony was the results of the Google search.
Objection, non-responsive.
Overruled.
Go ahead, officer.
The
Officer,
results of the
Patrick.
Google search showed that the only device that they were able to place with the association at the Chad Daybell residence was that of Alex Cox.
And that was at 9/9 of 2019.
That is correct.
So what we're saying is that on 9/9 of 2019, with all of this information from, and again, what was the starting time of this again?
On this
On
particular,
9/9, the earliest location information?
I
Do you
believe it was 9/19.
Okay.
It's at the top, but
And then this went well through 11:58 or 12 o'clock that day at the very bottom of the screen. Is that right?
yeah, well, this is not in chronological order. So I can't tell you the exact final time, but it was, yeah, sometime after 12 o'clock.
Third one from the bottom, it looks like I have a 12:10. Is that what that
Yes,
looks
I
like?
see that.
Okay. So if I understand your testimony, is that on 9/9 at approximately 9:19 through 12:10, there is no identification data showing that any device owned by Chad Daybell is on his property. Is that correct?
Yes, nothing in the evidence showed that.
Okay. And again, we talked a little bit about the ability to disengage that information and turn off your phone. That's possible, correct?
Yes,
He could have been there and he turned his phone off, right?
yes,
He could have been there and he turned his location off, correct?
yes,
He also could have taken the time to disengage each and every one of the apps to make sure there's no location data, correct?
yes.
Is this an easy task to do?
It's not easy to turn off all of it other than turning the device itself off.
Okay. 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 Did you have an occasion to do further review in terms of the scope of what you observed in terms of radius on this particular day?
Yes, I did.
And what did that involve?
So what I did was as part of the filtering of the raw data that was returned by Google, not only did I put it in chronological order, but you'll see, if I can point, some of the radiuses that were returned or requested to be identified are showing 4,000 meters, 8,000 meters from the radius that was requested as part of the geofence. What I did instead of going that far out is I went and I filtered it down to 10 meters or less throughout this record and identified 19 devices from the Google record on 9/9 that would have been 10 meters or less in margin of error radius. And that's what the record showed, 19 total.
So 19 devices that appear to be within 10 meters or less of a range. Now we need to talk about the area that we're talking about. So when we're describing it, it would be like a box. Would that be correct?
So the way they did it was a single point of reference. They just provided a single latitude and longitude and asked for a 250 meter radius around that.
Okay. And when we're talking 250 meters, if my math is correct, that's 3 feet, approximately 3 feet per meter,
Approximately.
750 feet from a certain point.
Yes.
And where is that certain point on the Daybell property on September 9th? Do you recall?
I don't recall the exact point, but I believe it was in the backyard.
Okay. Okay. And you recall Officer Stubbs' testimony pointing to somewhere in the vicinity of a fire pit or a pet cemetery?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So when we're talking about 250 meters, we're talking about phones that could identify or be in the area within 750 feet on their initial search. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And then you took the liberty of narrowing that down. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
And the process of narrowing that down, is that a complicated process or is it a matter of moving numbers?
Yes, so it's not complicated. They provide you the data in a spreadsheet format. And so you would turn on the filters and then select the column, and all of the numbers in this column here that show the radius would come up, and you would just deselect all and only select the ones that are less than 10 or less for the number. And then the spreadsheet would readjust and show you only those devices.
So when you're lowering the number, and explain that to me, I don't want to suggest anything to you, and I want to be educated on this. When you're lowering that number, you're drawing a location closer to that fire pit and that fire pit area. Would that be fair?
Yes, it's the margin of error. So that margin of error, the smaller the number, the closer to the radius it would be.
Okay, so when you narrowed the margin of error, and again, what did you narrow it down to?
10 meters or less.
And again, tell me what approximately in feet, what 10 meters is.
Approximately 30 feet.
Okay, so approximately 30 feet from the fire pit,
Well, it'd be 30 feet from the radius.
30 feet from the radius. And we don't know, and what would the radius again be?
250 meters.
So 750 feet,
That's correct.
and then within 15 feet beyond that, that would be where the margin of error,
30 feet.
30 feet beyond, 10 meters,
Yes, that's correct.
30 feet, excuse me. That's why I didn't excel in math or computers. So from the radius, we then have a margin of error of approximately 30 feet beyond the 250-meter radius around Chad Daybell's fire pit. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then what did you find when you narrowed the radius down to include the 30 feet of margin of error?
19 unique devices during that time period.
Okay. And at that point, when you say 19 devices, do you know what the phone numbers of those devices are?
I do not.
Was there a further inquiry by Officer Stubbs regarding that?
Yes, there was.
And how many devices did he pursue of those 19 that were within the Daybell radius of his property?
So according to the testimony, he stated there were 12. The search warrant that is part of this record that you're seeing on the screen says 11. But then he says that he never got an answer from Google until he finally got a hold of someone from Google, and they made him shrink it. So he says they dropped off 2, making it 10 for the return.
Okay. And is that a common thing for Google to do?
So it is common for them to try and shrink your radius on the first search warrant of when they're providing these records, but I have not found it common for them to try to shrink the number of devices that you're asking for identification on that would be within your proximity.
So when Officer Stubbs did this warrant, your testimony is that there were 19 devices within that radius, correct?
Of 10 meters
Of
or
10
less.
meters. And then Officer Stubbs elected to pick 11 of those according to the warrant.
According to the warrant, it says 11, yes.
So he excluded 8 of those. Is that right?
No.
What did he do with the other 8?
Oh, you mean excluded from
From his
the actual data?
the actual data.
Yes, I don't know. They were not submitted. Those device IDs were not submitted for identification information.
Okay. So at this point, we don't know what the identification though, but Officer Stubbs identified that they were not of interest. You recall that?
Well, he stated that.
Objection, misstates testimony.
Overruled.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
What I remember of it is that he stated that we're not based on the commonality, this is what they came to.
And when he's talking about the words commonality, what is he referring to?
The process that they chose to use to try to place the devices in multiple places that were associated with this return.
Okay, so and the multiple places, do you recall which of those multiple places were?
In this particular return, the data would have been the Chad Daybell residence and the Lori Vallow residence.
So in case there was some commonality in those two residences, the other 8 were excluded on that basis. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know why he chose to exclude them. I just know that they were not submitted as part of this warrant to Google.
So if an odd number of the device that wasn't at Lori Vallow's residence or whoever ticked off at Lori Vallow's residence, ticked isn't the right word, clicked or identified there, and it was just an odd vehicle that showed up at Chad Daybell's driveway, that would not have commonality. Would that be fair?
I don't know their method that they chose to do the commonality.
Okay. Would this be standard practice to do that?
Objection calls for speculation. He doesn't even know the reasoning behind what they did.
It's sustained.
Would in your practice of evaluating evidence, would that be something, a practice that you would engage in?
No, it's not.
Why would that be?
I would have asked for the identifying information for all of them in order to identify the individuals that would have been within that proximity
And why would you do that?
as part of investigating the crime.
To determine exactly who was there?
Well, to determine who the information belonged to and what they may know, yes.
Okay, so it's part of expanding the scope of what you're trying to learn about the case. Would that be fair?
That's correct.
So in other words, by ultimately excluding one phone just because it didn't happen to identify at Lori Vallow's residence, but it identified at Chad Daybell's residence, it still could be relevant to this investigation and provide information.
Objection leading.
Sustained.
Would the lack of contact with one of the common residences potentially still be useful?
It could be.
Okay. Now I want to go above the data that you have, and then if you get the pointer out again, if you would help me.
Sure.
At the very top number, I can't read the ID number under the blue, the very top one. You don't need to read it, but that's the first entry that you were provided. Is that correct?
That is not the first entry in the records.
Okay. Oh, the earliest entry would be what?
I would have to look at the record to remember, but it was before 9/19.
Okay. Would it have been helpful to have records earlier in the day for any purpose?
Yes.
And what would the purpose of having requested earlier records than at sometime at around 9 for purposes of evaluation?
You could also identify devices that would have been there prior to that time.
So if, for instance, if Mr. Daybell's device was there prior to 9 o'clock or was identified prior to 9 o'clock, that would have been one of the devices that you would have been able to locate or at least identify?
You would have the device ID and you'd have the ability to submit it to find out subscriber information, yes.
And to your knowledge, that wasn't done?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. And to your knowledge, again, there was no, based on the testimony of Agent Balance and Officer Stubbs, there was no identifying information that put Chad Daybell on the property at 9/9/2019. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. I'd like to move down to, if we can. I may have the wrong. And Judge, could I just have a moment, please? And
Yes.
just turn the HDMI off. And the light on, maybe. Can I just have a moment, Judge? I'm having some issues. Can't get this out of the way, and I can't get this other one out. All right, thank you. This is a numbers file, so it's kind of like Excel. Can I see what that is? Looked at a bunch of times. It's gonna open. I just need to be. But I'm ready. Sorry.
That's fine.
I apologize for the delay. Now we're looking at the date of 9/23. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And again, if you have the pointer, I can narrow this down again, hopefully. And again, if we can go through the analysis, we have the device ID, and if you would use the pointer and do that for me, if you're able to.
It's right there, that call.
Okay, and then the date would be again what?
9/23/2019.
And then we have the next would be the longitude, latitude,
The next would be the time.
the time, I'm sorry, and then the longitude or the latitude and then the longitude.
That's correct.
And then the last one would be the radius.
You have the source, which is GPS or Wi-Fi, and then you have the radius.
Okay,
And then the last column is a column that I added.
okay. So what's the relevance of 9/23 in terms of this investigation? Do you recall?
The relevance?
That would that have been the day that the remains of J.J. Vallow were found on Chad Daybell's property?
Yes, that's correct.
Objection misstates evidence. That wasn't the day that JJ Vallow was found there.
Yeah, sustain and strike that question.
In any event, the significance of the 9/23, did you again listen to the testimony of Dave Stubbs and Agent Balance?
Yes, I did.
And this chart represents what?
This chart represents the information that was returned by Google for the geofence warrant based on a location at the Daybell residence for 9/23 during that time period.
Okay. And again, what did you find of significance in this information?
So this is the non-filtered radius version, but in this information here, as with the color coded, the yellow information, and this is also not time sorted either. But what I did is it was time sorted to chronological order, thereby showing the exact process by which those IDs would have been near that radius.
Okay. And the source of that information on your yellow, it says something about Homer at the very right-hand side.
Yes, Homer J. Maximus,
And then in parentheses, you have a name.
Alex Cox.
Okay. And would it suggest then that the yellow highlighted is the source information of Alex Cox's phone on the Daybell property on 9/23/19?
That's the information that's associated with that Gmail. Yes.
And then in the green, what does that indicate?
The green indicates that is information, device IDs that were submitted to have requesting information, subscriber information provided back as a return based on this information.
Okay. And again, did you do your analysis in terms of trying to determine whether this is a complete list of all of the phones that had contact at that time?
Yes, I did.
And what did you find?
So this chart should be the complete list. The
Okay,
charts that I placed and provided was the complete chart.
okay. And what does that mean?
That it has all of the records that would have been provided by Google at that time.
Okay. And as a review of this, was there any further follow-up as to identify these ID numbers to your recollection?
Only the ones in green and also the one in yellow.
Were there other phone records that, for whatever reason, were not included in the search for identification of those ID numbers on that chart?
Not phone numbers, but device
Phone
IDs.
devices,
Device IDs.
device IDs.
Yes.
And how many of them were there?
On 923, I would have to look. If this is the entire chart that I provided, you would look at the white boxes for the unique numbers. You would
Okay.
have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
So there were to be 10 other devices that were not included for information to obtain. Would that be fair?
That's correct.
But there were how many, if you could count for me in the green, that they decided to do for further inquiry?
On this particular day, based on what I'm seeing on the screen, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
So if I understand correctly, there were 16 devices that indicated phone location data at or near the Daybell property on the 23rd of September. Is that correct?
Adding in yes, that's correct.
That would include Alex Cox's phone data at that point, correct?
That's correct.
Did at any point you take the task of narrowing the radius to try to what I'm not sure what the proper word is, narrowing the radius to maybe exclude others that were not as close?
Yes, and I correct that. Including Alex Cox, it would be 17.
Okay. So again, did you narrow the radius to maybe refine your results?
I did.
What did you find then?
So as you would see within this chart, if you were to remove the numbers that are more than 10, you would see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, excuse me. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, so there'd be 4 devices that once you excluded, and again, the radius that you used to exclude would have been what?
10 meters.
So again, 30 feet from the location point, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And of those 4, how many of those within the 10 meters were sent for further identification?
None to my knowledge.
So when you have 4 phones that are within the 30 feet of the area set by Officer Stubbs, of those 4, they chose not to try to identify those phones. Is that what you're saying?
Objection, that misstates Stubbs' testimony.
Sustained.
Was there any indication that they pursued the identification of the 4 phones within the 10-meter radius that you just identified?
No.
Is there any indication through the testimony of Officer Stubbs or Balance that any phone device of Chad Daybell was located on that property on 923 within the time range you set forth here?
Nothing in the evidence I was provided or reviewed.
I'd like to, and Judge, I think I'm done with the HDMI, if that's okay.
Okay, we'll unpublish.
And I do need the Elmo on, Judge. You prepared a report in contemplation of testimony in this case, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
And that was previously marked and accepted as an Exhibit 137. Judge, I took the liberty of providing the state with a paper copy. I'd ask permission that I think the state can acknowledge that the paper copy is directly identical to the 137 exhibit that I've submitted and has been accepted by the court.
All right, counsel, I need a sidebar before we get into publishing on that report, please. Thank you. Please be seated. Okay, we're back on the record on CR 22-21-1623, State of Idaho versus Chad Daybell, continuing with direct examination of Mr. Eller. The exhibits been taken care of on 137 and admitted. So, Mr. Pryor, if you'd like to continue with your direct, you may.
And Judge, could I have use of the Elmo? May I?
Yes.
And before we start with that, I just want to recap a little bit. You had mentioned that from your review of the devices and the data that was provided, that Chad Daybell's, there was no indication of a phone associated with Chad Daybell was indicated on September 23rd, 2019 and September 9th, 2019 on the Chad Daybell property. Is that correct?
That's correct. No device ID.
Did you happen to look as part of the, and I guess we'll start with this, there was a significant amount of data that was provided to you, is that correct?
Yes, there was.
And in one instance, there was a sizable amount of data, terabytes on one particular indication, right?
Yes, I believe it was approximately 10 terabytes.
And 10 terabytes would fill a room about what size? Paper to paper.
The way that, we've typically described that is if you were to take the Library of Congress, if it was all printed, just 1 terabyte would fill it.
Okay. So 10 times the Library of Congress is what you were reviewing. Okay. As part of your review, did you look at the status of any of the devices of Mr. Daybell in relation to the time of September 9th and September 23rd?
Yes, I looked at the return data for the chad.daybell@gmail.com, the information pertaining to that email account.
Would you be able through that email account to determine whether or not Mr. Daybell's account was enabled or not enabled?
I can say yes.
And when you say yes, does that mean that the account was enabled?
So the account itself was enabled and it lists the services that would have been part of that account.
Okay. And when we use the term that it's enabled, what does that mean?
That means it's active.
Does that mean it's receptive to gathering information?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to switch gears a little bit and go to the report that you prepared as part of your help in this case with me. Do you recall that report?
Yes, I do.
Judge, if I could have the Elmo again, I'm sorry.
You may.
Now we're looking at information as it relates to, I'll refer first to September 6th of 2019. Do you see that?
Yes.
And what does this information represent?
It represents information that was returned by Google for the Homer Maximus at gmail.com location data.
And whose phone would be assigned to the Homer J. Maximus at gmail.com?
Alex Cox.
So I start with September 6th of 2019, and it looks like it says 12/42/54 on September 6th. And what does that information suggest?
That information suggests that there was a location point located in the records for a device associated with that account to be at or near the Chad Daybell residence at that time.
Now at 12:42, it says Chad Daybell residence with that longitude and latitude.
That's correct.
Would that suggest that that device was on the Chad Daybell residence on September 6th at that time?
Yes, it would suggest it was there on the property.
And then again at 12:44?
Yes, that's correct.
And then again at 12:51?
Yes, that's correct.
Then at 12:53?
That's correct.
Now, is there any way to determine between those times whether or not at any time between the minutes between those that that device left the residence?
No.
Okay. And then at 12:55, the device associated with Alex Cox placed him on the residence or south of the residence?
That's correct.
And you put something called Salem Pines Lane, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Any information that, do you have any information to suggest that Chad Daybell was at that location on September 6th?
I do not.
Okay. We'll go to September 9th. And on September 9th, are we still talking about the device associated with Alex Cox?
Yes, that's correct.
And at that point, we have a 9:15:43. It looks like it says south of Chad Daybell residence. You see
Yes,
that?
that's correct.
And then at 9:21:36, Chad Daybell residence, correct?
Yes.
Now I want to go back to the geofence. And when you talked about the geofence and the identifiers, the indication is this 921 is consistent with what Officer Stubbs had indicated. And Officer Balance indicated about the locator ID on the Daybell property. Is that correct?
That is
I'm going to
correct.
object to that question. Nick, Balance did not testify about the geofence.
Sustain.
Officer Stubbs testify about the geofence?
Yes, that's correct.
And then again, we show the device at 9:22:50, again, indicating the device is at the Chad Daybell residence.
That's correct.
And then at 9:26, there's a indication that the device is at the residence.
That's correct.
And then there's a gap between 9:26 and 10:39. Between 9:26 and 10:39, is there any indication that the device would still be at the Chad Daybell residence?
There's no data to show that it was there, but there's also no data to show it was not.
So it's undetermined as to whether or not the device was there or not.
That's correct.
Would it be unusual for there not to be some sort of a ping or indication that the device was there?
It depends on what's being used on the device or if the
Okay.
device is powered on.
Okay. And then we go to 10:41. So between 9:21 and 10:39, well, from 9:21 to 9:26, for that 5 minutes, we know the device was at or near the Chad Daybell residence, correct?
Can you repeat that question?
Between 9:21 and 9:26, we know that the device was at or near the Daybell residence. Is that correct?
Yes, there were 3 location points that showed that.
Okay. And then from 9:26 to 10:39, we can't say one way or the other where the device associated with Alex Cox was in terms of that property. Is that correct?
That's correct, not from this data.
Okay. And from 9:39 to 10:41. At that point, the device at 10:41 appears to be in the vicinity of the Daybell residence.
That's correct.
Do you recall what vicinity it was in?
I believe it was, without seeing the map that associated with this, but I believe it was near the front of it.
Okay. And then at 10:43 again?
Yes, that's correct.
And then at 10:57, we're back at the residence, is that right?
That's correct.
And then from 10:57 to 11:39, you have some movement, is that correct?
Yes,
So at 10:57, there's some movement. And then 11:39, you have it in the vicinity, is that correct?
that's correct.
And then moving on, you have it north of the residence, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, I went back with you with the, in terms of Alex Cox's device showing that he's at least partially between 9:21 and 10:57, he was on the property and potentially off the property during that time, correct?
Could be.
Okay. And are you aware of any communications between, any communications in terms of text messages or emails that were sent from the Chad Daybell device?
Yes,
And would those emails or text messages that were sent, would those have indicated a identification number and a location through Google by the use of that device?
they could have.
And at no point did they indicate that by the sending of a text message through the Chad Daybell device, that he was in the vicinity of the Chad Daybell property. Is that correct?
No records that I was provided showed that.
And again, September at 2:30, we have west of the Chad Daybell residence. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then south of the Chad Daybell residence?
That's correct.
If you don't have a specific recollection, but if you do have a recollection, you know how far he was from the residence?
I don't remember.
Okay. And again, we discussed this through your geofence testimony about the device of the Alex Cox device indicating that the device was on the Chad Daybell residence on September 23rd, correct?
That's correct.
And on September 23rd, you also testified that there is no geofence evidence or indication through Google or any electronic evidence suggesting that on the 23rd of September, Chad Daybell's device was there as well, correct?
No evidence I reviewed could place him at the residence.
Okay. And again, we place him at the residence from 10:55 to approximately 10:12. Is that correct?
That would be 9:55.
I'm sorry, I said 10. Not, thank you for correcting me. 9:55 to 10:12. Is that correct?
That is correct. Multiple time points in that time period.
We then go to the September 25, 2019. Do you see that?
Yes,
And again, we have the indication of Alex Cox's device on the Chad Daybell residence.
that's correct.
And that would have been from 10:05 on the 25th of September. Is that right?
That is correct.
To 10:24 on the 25th of September. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And again, we're referring to October 9 of 2019. And that would have been the date of the alleged paintball incident. The time that we have for Alex Cox, we didn't place him at any time on October 9th on the Daybell property. Is that correct?
The records did not.
But the records did show that he was south of the residence at 450, correct?
Yes, it did.
And then south again for someplace at 501, at a place called Salem Pines Lane.
That is correct.
So we have him there for 11 minutes south and east of the Daybell property, correct?
That is correct.
What is the radius for all of these?
I would have to look at it, but I believe it's 1.4 miles.
Okay. So 1.4 miles from the Daybell residence, that would be the marker for what you use to establish contact or lack of contact.
That's the radius we used around the Daybell residence to associate to whether there was a time point that would be associated with this data.
Now, previously you saw from I believe it was Officer Stubbs, they used a 2.6 or a 3-mile radius for theirs in terms of the location data for Mr. Daybell. Is that,
Objection misstates the evidence.
Sustain.
do you recall what the radius that was used by Officer Stubbs in his report?
250 meters.
250 meters. And the significance of going out to a larger radius would have been what?
It would just capture more location points of the device.
Does it affect the accuracy by just expanding the radius of how far you go out to determine this?
No,
So there's nothing in terms of accuracy that changes as a result of just going further out to try to gain more location points for, at least for Alex Cox's phone. Is that correct?
that's correct. The accuracy would be a separate reading. This was just putting points within a specific radius.
Okay. And then we didn't include this on the report, but you also reviewed information as it related to October 19th in regards to the device of Alex Cox. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what were your findings in regards to October 19th?
There was no indication that it was at or near the property based on our findings, which is why it's not in our report.
Okay. And then when you say that there was no indication that the Alex Cox device was there on the 19th, that is within a 1.5 mile radius of his property,
1.4.
1.4 mile radius of his property?
That's correct.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the concept of drive testing.
Okay.
You heard some testimony previously about the drive testing that was conducted as part of this case. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And in your review, did you come to some determinations as to what your understanding of what they did in terms of the drive testing?
Yes, I did.
What indications did you arrive at?
So the drive testing that was completed showed the coverage area for multiple towers surrounding that area. What that does is it shows you the coverage area that could be used by a device. It does not show you RF signal strength or signal strength from a device, but also what the coverage area does is from a drive test just allows you to see where you would be able to potentially reach a tower if you were to utilize your device across the cellular network.
Okay. So in other words, when you're talking about towers, if there's a certain angle, and let's say it's a 120-degree angle,
Yes,
that angle goes out for an extended period of time.
it does.
And wherever there may be overlap or otherwise, the distance that goes out determines a significantly large area for cell tower testing, right?
That is correct. And the difference in listening to the testimony about the drive test was when it was discussed about,
Objection, this is non-responsive to a question.
Abstain.
So based on the testimony that you heard about the drive testing, what were your concerns?
my concerns were the 5 degrees beam width difference that was reported between 2019 and 2020.
Okay. And when you say 5 degrees difference, what would that affect?
Well, it wasn't explained which way it was 5 degrees. So when you look at that sector, it's 60 degrees counterclockwise and 60 degrees clockwise. And without knowing the 5 degrees that it was off, it could change dramatically that coverage area, depending on how far away a device would have been from the tower when it was made from that sector.
So for the use of drive testing, would that be, and given what you just stated, would that cause a concern about the reliability of drive testing?
It wouldn't cause a concern for reliability about drive testing itself. I would just wonder if the 5 degrees was taken into account for the mapping of the drive testing
Okay.
for presentation purposes.
Is drive testing considered a scientific test?
Drive testing is used by the mobile network carriers and providers to test tower coverage for signals.
It's not to be used to determine the location of a device to any extent of accuracy. Would that be fair?
The drive test itself can't locate the device. It only shows tower coverage.
Okay. There was some discussion about something called gladiator forensics. You recall that?
Yes.
And you recall that I believe it was Agent Balance talked about the availability of gladiator forensics to the public to test devices.
Yes, that's correct.
Did you look into the availability of gladiator forensics for someone like your corporation or the public?
I did.
And what did you find?
They responded to me that it is law enforcement and government only.
So is there any way to challenge the reliability of gladiator forensics or their testing without a law enforcement license to do so?
Not with their tool.
Okay, so in other words, when some of the testimony regarding data, regarding phone coverage, regarding all of those things, you wouldn't, given that they use the tool of gladiator forensics, you would not be able to challenge, and we would have to rely on solely what they claim to be the information. Would that be correct?
You can take that data and map it utilizing other tools, but that doesn't mean that the algorithms that their tool is using will be the same. So the results may or may not show based on what is being set up inside the tool by the manufacturer for the parsing of that data. So not testing it with the same tool does not necessarily give you a reliable accuracy based on the tool they used.
Okay. So if there was a representation that gladiator forensics could be purchased by anyone for use, would that have been an inaccurate statement?
Objection, misstates the testimony. That was never said.
Sustain.
Do you recall Officer Belenz talking about the availability of gladiator forensics?
I do.
And what do you recall him saying?
He said that their tools are not, but the tools that you use to do drive testing, meaning the antennas, the signals, and they talk about it, being calibrated by Rhodes and Schwartz for the drive test tools, which I also reached out through Rhodes and Schwartz and through their distributors and was told that I could not purchase those either.
So we have to rely on law enforcement's representations as to the total accuracy of anything they're suggesting. Would that be fair?
Yes.
Can I utilize the Elmo again?
Yes.
Thank you, Your Honor. There is some reference here to based on records that you obtained about communications. Do you recall who these communications were?
You're talking on the screen, September 1st, October 31st?
Yes,
Like through those dates?
yes.
Yes.
Did you detail the communications that took place when Alex Cox was identified to be at the vicinity or in the vicinity of the Daybell residence?
I did.
Okay. And you identified those by date, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So on September 9th, there's one voice call, is that correct?
That is correct.
On September 22nd, there were 8 text messages, one voice call.
That is correct.
On September 23rd, there was one voice call.
That is correct.
And October 9th, there's 13 text messages, 0 voice calls.
That is correct.
You didn't identify, those could potentially be to a number of different people. Would that be fair? They aren't necessarily Alex Cox calling the same person, right?
They are not.
Okay. And that was based on the data that you had at the time, is that correct?
That is correct.
And Judge, at this time, I have no further questions.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Pryor. All right, Mr. Wood, cross-examination.
I can be handed fence exhibit 139.
Yes.
And Your Honor, because of the digital nature of that, it may take me a minute to set up.
Okay.
And if I could also be handed States Exhibit 156 and 229 and 186.
All right, we'll work on getting those located and getting them delivered to you, Mr. Wood.
Thank you. And if it's all right, I'm going to wait to start until I have the exhibits so I can do it in a succinct fashion.
That's fine. We'll go ahead and get things located and wait.
There we go. Good morning, Mr. Eller.
Morning, sir.
Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes, sir.
You don't need to call me sir.
Just habit.
I get it. I want to talk to you about September 9th, 2019 and the work you did in this case for that date. Are you aware of the significance of the date of September 9th, 2019?
Yes,
Are you aware through your investigation of the last known sighting of Tylee Ryan?
I am.
And that was September 8th, 2019, correct?
That's correct.
In preparation for your testimony, we just went over a written report you did. You created visual representations of the data you mapped, correct?
That's correct.
And Your Honor, may I publish?
Yes, which exhibit?
This would be State's Exhibit 139. And in fact, maybe we need to have a sidebar about the labeling of this because there's subparts on this exhibit. There's 14 subparts.
Previously admitted.
Yes, of 139 defense exhibit.
Okay, feel free to just continue, Mr. Wood. If we have questions, we can do
Okay.
that sidebar, but
Perfect.
if you can, for the clarity of the record, reference any sub-exhibits.
Okay. And I would list this as defense exhibit 139 sub 3. And Mr. Eller, does this look familiar to you?
Yes, it does.
This is the report you created, correct?
This is a slideshow that represents data from the report. Yes.
Thank you. That's the more accurate way to say it. What does this slide represent?
As far as
What's the data being portrayed on that slide?
it's just showing locations.
And are these locations related to the Homer J. Maximus Google account?
Yes.
Correct. And I've clicked on is this video? There's a video embedded in this.
That's correct.
Can you tell the jury what this video shows?
Yes. The video would show the time frame represented and the points on when they would show on the map during that time frame.
All right. And this slide, what time frame does this cover?
I would have to see the slider for the video.
If I start playing it, would that aid you?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to play it.
That entry said 0915.
And is there indeed a label up here that says this is at Chad Daybell's residence?
That's correct.
I want to go back to earlier in the day. What does this video show? In fact, is it labeled?
It says video of all Google location data for September 9th.
So if we were to play this video, it would show all of the Homer J. Maximus location hits that you mapped out
For that date.
for that date. Correct, for September 9th.
Yes.
And did you put any limiting margin of error on these?
Yes,
Okay, and was that the 500 meters?
that's correct.
Thank you. So I'm going to start playing this video and I'm going to move it to about 2 minutes and 42 seconds. I'm going to start at 2:38. Can you make out what that data point is?
It is a Wi-Fi data point
Okay, and where is it located?
in the vicinity of Lori Vallow and Alex Cox's residence, I believe.
All right, and can you pinpoint at which residence it is at?
No. Not based on the visual representation on the screen.
Right. Let me ask you this. Did you locate any data suggesting that the Homer J. Maximus account on the morning of September 9th, early morning of September 9th, went to apartment 175?
Did I map that out? No. I don't believe so.
Are you aware that a device associated with Homer J. Maximus at was at 107, apartment 107, Alex's apartment, in the early morning of September 9th,
Correct?
and then in the early morning hours went to apartment 175?
That's correct. Yes.
And it was that, do you know approximately how long it was there?
Not without looking at the records.
Okay.
It was several hours, I believe.
Okay, thank you. So he was there for some time in the early morning hours.
That's correct.
I want to talk about a little bit later in that day. You did some work detailing, Your Honor, if I could unpublish for a moment,
Yes.
phone calls that were made between Chad Daybell and Alex Cox, or numbers known to be associated with the Chad Daybell and Alex Cox, correct?
That's correct.
Your Honor, if I could republish.
Yes.
This chart, this shows a calling number, or this shows a phone call at 8:11 a.m., correct?
Yes, it does.
And the calling number is 208-690-9374, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And that is a number associated with Chad Daybell, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And he calls 480-351-9120.
That's correct.
And that is a number associated with Alex Cox and the Homer J. Maximus account, correct?
That is correct.
And again, so that's at 8:11. Do you recall what time Alex Cox first shows up on Chad Daybell's property on September 9th?
I believe it is approximately 9:21.
So if we watched this video you prepared, it would tell us, correct?
I believe so.
And I'm going to pause when it first shows. So this data point that appears just south of Chad Daybell's residence.
That's correct.
And what is the time on that?
9:15.
All right. And what time was the phone call made from Chad to Alex?
I believe 8:11.
Yes, correct. Thank you. I'm going to play it again. And so what time
9:21.
does this show that Alex Cox's phone shows up on Chad Daybell's property?
9:21.
And this was also reflected in the cast report, correct, that you reviewed?
That's correct.
So just really quick, as we do this, the cast report used some different parameters than you did, correct?
That's correct.
So they used 100-meter margin of error, and you used a 500-meter margin of error.
That's correct. There was 100 for that, 150, 250, 500 across all the different reports.
Right. And I'm just speaking about the cast.
Yes, that's correct.
And for different purposes, you might use a different margin of error, correct?
That's correct.
And at different points in an investigation, you might rely on different margins of error depending on what you're trying to do, correct?
Yes.
And so there's nothing invalid about using a 100-meter margin of error or a 500-meter margin of error, correct?
No, there's nothing invalid about either.
And Your Honor, I am going to now go to State's Exhibit 156, the cast report. And you reviewed this cast report, correct?
Could you clarify the exhibit number, Mr. Wood?
156.
156, thank you.
No, it's not sure. You reviewed this cast report, correct, as part of your investigation?
Yes, once I received it.
So. And you recognize this slide.
Yes, I do.
And this slide shows in general some of the same data we were just looking at on the slide you presented.
That's correct.
And so just again, on September 9th, what you've established and what's also in the cast report is that Chad Daybell made a phone call to Alex Cox at 11 a.m.
At 8:11.
Thank you, at
AM.
8:11 a.m. And then just a little more than an hour later, Alex Cox or a phone associated with him or a device associated with him shows up at Chad Daybell's property.
That's correct.
Are you familiar with the burial location of Tylee Ryan?
Based on the testimony and the evidence I reviewed, yes.
And in fact, did you map that out as well, correct?
That's correct.
And you would agree that some of these location points for the Homer J. Maximus account are in close proximity to both the burn pit on Chad Daybell's property and Tylee Ryan and the final location spot for Tylee Ryan.
Yes.
As part of your investigation, you said you reviewed many devices
Devices and records, yes.
and records. Okay. In fact, real quick, I want to ask you about that. In your report, actually, I guess it's. And can you tell us approximately which devices you reviewed?
Oh,
Is it too large of a number?
it's a large list. I mean, it was almost 10 terabytes of data that was turned over.
Okay. Yeah,
And
massive undertaking, correct?
yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
And it's difficult for any one person to get through all of that material, correct?
I spent a lot of late nights over Christmas going through data that was turned over. Yes.
Okay. Did you review a cell phone belonging to Tammy Daybell?
I don't remember at this time.
Okay, that's fine. You talked about not having any information, any geolocation data from Chad Daybell that placed him on the property, correct?
That's correct.
Are you aware that he sent a text to his wife that placed him on the property?
Yes, but that doesn't place him on the property.
Are you aware that in his text, he talks about burning limbs in a fire pit?
Yes.
And are you aware that he talks about shooting a raccoon
Yes.
and that he talks about burying it in a pet cemetery?
Yes.
And are you aware that there was a pet cemetery on his property?
Yes.
And are you aware that that pet cemetery is the same location that Tylee Ryan was located?
Yes.
And are you aware, Mr. Eller, that upon finding that text message from Chad Daybell to his wife and combining that data with the data that you see right now and data that you've mapped as well, was how law enforcement
Judge,
found.
objection, speculation, and argumentative.
I'm asking if he's aware.
Mr. Wood, first, let me make a ruling, and before you make response, please. So the objection is overruled.
Okay, I'll ask the question again. Mr. Eller, are you aware that upon finding that email, or I'm sorry, that text from Chad Daybell to Tammy Daybell sent on September 9th, and looking at that data with the data that's placed on the screen right now, similar to data you've mapped, was how law enforcement found Tylee Ryan?
No,
Would it surprise you that that information was how law enforcement?
Judge,
found
I'm going to
Tylee Ryan?
object at this point. Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Let's talk about September 23rd. And Your Honor, if I could unpublish for a minute.
You may
And I apologize for the pauses. There's just a lot of digital data to be working with.
understand.
I'm going to start with what would be marked as Defense Exhibit 139, Subpart 13. And if I could publish at this point.
You may.
Mr. Eller, do you recognize this chart?
yes,
And at the bottom of that chart, there's a call record that's been, there's some details provided for.
yes.
Who is the calling number? Or I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. What is the calling number?
The calling number is 208-690-9374.
And is it correct that that number is associated with Chad Daybell?
Yes, that's correct.
And who is the call, or what is the called number?
480-351-9120.
And is it correct that that number is associated with Alex Cox?
Yes, that's correct.
And what time was that call?
0925.
And going back to your report, on September 23rd, the information you were provided placed the Homer J. Maximus or a device associated with Homer J. Maximus on Chad Daybell's property that morning, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And it first showed up at 9:55 in the morning, correct?
I believe so.
So we have a situation here similar to.
Objection, argumentative.
Sustained.
Okay. So there's a phone call made from Chad Daybell to Alex Cox at 9:25,
Yes,
or numbers associated with them.
that's correct.
At 9:55, Alex Cox or a phone number or a device associated with them shows up on Chad Daybell's property.
That's correct.
Are you aware of the significance of September 23rd, 2019?
Yes,
What is that?
that is the day after the last sighting, I believe, of JJ.
Your Honor, if I could unpublish for a moment,
You may.
and I will be publishing from Defense Exhibit 139, Subpart 5. And Your Honor, if I could publish.
You may.
Mr. Eller, do you recognize this slide?
Yes, I do.
Could you read the label of it?
Video of Google location data at Chad Daybell's residence on September 23rd, 2019.
And you prepared this video by mapping
Yes, that's correct.
of Homer J. Maximus, correct?
That's correct.
So I'm going to push play. And can you describe where I just paused, what the data being presented is?
Yes, that is a Wi-Fi location point with an accuracy of 50 meters on 923 at 0955.
And I'm going to push play again. And can you describe the data being represented here?
Yes, that is a GPS location point on 923 at 956 with an accuracy of 4 meters.
And would you agree that that location is close to the final or the spot where JJ Vallow's body was found?
Yes,
In fact, could you point with your marker? I believe you have it marked on that screen. Could you point to the location of JJ's body? Okay, thank you. And I'm pushing play again and stopping. And what's the data here?
that is a location point from Wi-Fi source with 100-meter accuracy on 923 at 957.
And so at this point, is it fair to say that that device could have been located anywhere within that circle?
Yes,
I'm pushing play again. What is the data being represented here?
that is a location point that's GPS on 923 at 1002 with 3-meter accuracy.
Thank you. And I'm pushing play again. And is this another spot you mapped? We don't need to list out all the details, but this was another
Yes.
spot you mapped. And this was at 10:05, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. I'm pushing play again. This was a spot at 10:07 that you mapped.
That's correct.
Appears to be on the southwest corner of the property,
Yes.
but with it, that's a 92-meter
Radius.
radius.
Yes.
Thank you. Again, one more spot that you mapped at 10:12.
That is correct.
So you would agree with me that the Homer J. Maximus account that you mapped on September 9th shows spots close to the location of Tylee Ryan's body where it was located, correct?
You said September 9th? Yes.
Yeah, I'm going back to September 9th. I'm not trying to confuse you.
Okay.
Going back to September 9th.
Yes.
And on September 23rd, the Homer J. Maximus account is located, shows at least 2 points very close to the location of where JJ's body was located.
Yes.
And on both those days, within close to an hour of when the Homer J. Maximus account shows up on Chad Daybell's residence, Chad Daybell called Alex Cox.
That's correct.
And let me be correct, let me be specific. A phone number associated with Chad Daybell called a phone number associated with Alex Cox.
That's correct.
And just to be clear, you also, for this date, you also as well mapped out the whole day of geolocation data, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And I'm not going to play it right now, but so that you could actually watch Chad Daybell's movements throughout the day.
Objection, Judge.
Overruled.
Judge, mischaracterization?
The question's not done yet, so at this stage, I'm overruling an objection. Go ahead, Mr. Wood.
Let me rephrase that. Either way, you can watch on these videos you prepared the location. I'm not going to say in real time because it's in shortened time, but of the location data of the Homer J. Maximus account.
That's correct.
And we talked about methodologies earlier. How sometimes in a different investigation, you might use one methodology, you might use something else for another investigation. And there's valid reasons to be using different methodologies, correct?
Yes.
And in this case, to determine when you would map out the Homer J. Maximus account as it relates to Chad Daybell's property, you drew a 1.4 mile circle around Chad Daybell's property.
That's correct.
And anytime the Homer J. Maximus account showed up in there, you would make note of that. Well, let me rephrase that. And I think you know what I'm trying to say, right? Once the Homer J. Maximus account showed up in there, if it had less than a 500-meter margin of error, you mapped it.
Yes, that's correct.
Mr. Defense Counsel spoke with you briefly about October 9th.
Yes.
And I would note in your report, and it's in there, that you disagree with the FBI about the number of text messages that were exchanged between Alex and Chad.
That's correct.
Even based on what you found.
That's correct.
Yeah, and based on what you found, you show that 13 text messages were exchanged between Chad Daybell and Alex Cox on October 9th.
That's correct.
And you're aware that that same day, Tammy Daybell reported being shot at by a paintball gun.
I didn't know that it was shot at. That's not what my understanding of it is.
Okay. But you're aware there was that incident.
That's correct.
Okay. And at the time of that incident, the Homer J. Maximus account, as far as you can tell, was located in Rexburg, correct?
That is, well, what I can tell is that it was not within that radius.
Okay. That's fair. So it wasn't in that 1.4 mile radius.
That's correct.
So you didn't map out where else it went.
I did, but
Okay.
it was not reported for the purpose of that report for that radius around the
Okay.
residence.
So you for the purposes of your investigation, you mapped it out. It's not on your report.
That's correct.
Okay. And that's fair. Are you aware through the Homer J. Maximus account where Alex Cox went earlier that day in Idaho Falls?
I believe so, yes.
Are you aware that he went to a Sportsman's Warehouse?
Yes.
Did you review any reports on what he purchased while he was there?
I believe it was in the discovery, yes.
Okay. Now, with your 1.4 mile radius, that excluded the Homer J. Maximus account for October 18th, correct?
That is correct.
But are you aware, or were you aware, that the Homer J. Maximus account was located 2.5 to 2.6 miles just south of Chad Daybell's residence that night?
At Salem Church, yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you. And you're aware that multiple text messages were shared between Chad Daybell and Alex Cox that night?
Yes.
And they were on phones that they had both activated on October 9th. Were you aware of that?
Yes.
And is it because of the 1.4 mile radius that you did not include those text messages in your report?
That's correct.
Really quick on the geofence. Uh, Mr. Pryor talked with you about Detective Stubbs' testimony that Google informed him they would only return information on a specific number of Google IDs.
Yes, that's correct. I was a little confused at first because there's been a bunch of numbers and none of them were the same.
And it was your testimony that you're not familiar with Google doing that.
I'm not familiar with them limiting what we're asking them to describe or provide subscriber information for. That is correct.
But that doesn't mean that's not what they said to Mr. Stubbs.
That's correct. I seen no documentation from Google that said that they asked for that either, though.
Okay. That was based on his testimony.
Correct. I'm just saying from the Google responses, their returns and the emails that went back and forth through LERS, I didn't see anything where they said that they were limiting that.
Okay. And again, that information is just based on Detective Stubbs' testimony.
Correct.
And you do agree that in that geofence, the Homer J. Maximus account does show up on Chad Daybell's property.
Yes.
In fact, it's similar to these areas you've mapped.
Yes, I think identical.
Yes. And are you aware of, through your review of the discovery, Alex Cox's relationship with Chad Daybell?
I believe he's his brother-in-law.
Well, he was his brother-in-law, correct?
Correct.
You're aware that Alex Cox is deceased?
Yes, sorry.
No, that's okay. Did you review any iCloud accounts belonging to Lori Vallow?
I did.
Did you listen to any audio of blessings being given by Chad Daybell?
Judge, I'm
to
going to
Alex
object at this
Cox?
point. It goes beyond the scope of direct examination.
Sustained.
May I briefly argue, Your Honor?
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Wood.
I'm asking him about digital evidence he's reviewed, which was the substance of his testimony.
Judge, that's a broad sweep.
Yeah, I think it's outside the scope of anything brought up on direct, Mr. Wood, at this point.
Okay, thank you. That's fine. And you testified you were unable to find any geolocation data for Chad Daybell?
That's correct.
And you're aware through your review that Chad Daybell used multiple phones?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
All right, thank you, Mr.
I have multiple exhibits here to return to the court.
Very well.
Permission to approach the podium.
You may.
Mr. Eller, Prosecutor Wood indicated that there was a phone call at 8:11 from Chad Daybell to Alex Cox.
Yes.
Do you have any information that the warrants that they obtained from Google would have included data information from that phone call?
No.
In fact, there was no data information that they investigated regarding that phone call. Is that correct?
I believe that there would have been a record, a cell tower transmission record for the call.
Okay. But there would be no identifiable way to say the location of Mr. Daybell's phone. Is that right?
Not an exact location, no.
And then that applies to the 923 as well. Is that correct?
That's correct.
On those phone calls, is there any indication, in fact, all of these phone calls that were referenced, is there any indication whatsoever of what was discussed on those phone calls?
No,
And again, on 9/9 and 9/23, during the time that Alex Cox's phone is showing he's on the Chad Daybell property, do you have any electronic information or data of any kind to suggest the Chad Daybell's device was on the property at the same exact time?
no.
Nothing else, Judge.